So, how do our minds actually make sense of the world? I mean, we're constantly drawing conclusions about everything around us. We're inferring. Today, we're going to dig into a really fundamental question. Do all of our inferences, from those deep gut feelings to solving tricky logic puzzles, use the exact same mental tools? Let's dive in and find out.
Here's the plan for our journey. We'll kick things off with a huge idea from the 10th century scientist Ibn al-Haytham. Then we'll jump forward in time and see how modern psychology throws a wrench in that idea with something called the surprised infant problem. From there, we'll get into a new way of thinking about all this using two key concepts, representations and procedures. We'll then compare two very different ways to infer, and finally, wrap it all up by looking at what this means for a modular view of how we reason.
All right, so our story begins with a truly brilliant mind from the 10th century, Ibn al-Haytham. He was really one of the first people to systematically ask, how does this whole inference thing work? Not just in lofty philosophy, but in the automatic, everyday miracle of just seeing the world. And that led him to a core question that we're still wrestling with today. Just think about it for a second. On one hand, you have the slow, deliberate process of working through a complex argument. That's conscious inference, right? But then on the other hand, you have the way you instantly and automatically perceive depth and distance just by opening your eyes. That's unconscious inference. So the question is, are these two radically different experiences actually using the same underlying mental machinery?
Ibn al-Haytham made a really bold claim. He said, yep, they do. He proposed that despite how different they feel, every single form of inference, from the highest levels of philosophy all the way down to the most basic acts of perception, uses one single general method. And back in his day, the best tool for that job was the formal logic of Aristotelian syllogisms.
Okay, but that idea immediately creates a puzzle, doesn't it? If we're using the same logical tools for everything, then why is thinking through a philosophy paper so slow and hard, while recognizing a friend's face is instant and totally effortless? Why can't we just flip a switch and use that fast mode all the time?
Well, his answer was actually pretty ingenious. It came down to one word: habit. He argued that every inference, no matter how simple it seems to us now, has to start out as a conscious, effortful process. But through constant routine and repetition, it becomes so practiced that it becomes automatic, so fast that we don't even notice we're doing it. The key takeaway here is that it's not a different type of inference, just a different level of practice.
Now, that's a really compelling theory, but does it hold up when you test it? This is where modern developmental psychology comes in and puts this classical view to the test, which leads us to what you could call the surprised infant problem.
Check this out. This is a classic experiment by psychologists Amy Needham and Renee Balayarjan. They showed 4.5-month-old infants two different scenes. In one, the possible event, a hand puts a box down on a platform. Totally normal. But in the other, the impossible event, the hand lets go of the box in midair and it just hangs there, totally defying gravity.
And the results were so telling. The infants consistently stared much longer at the impossible floating box. Now, this difference in looking time is really strong evidence that they were surprised. It means they already had an expectation that an object without support should fall. And this inference, this expectation clearly wasn't slow or conscious. It was completely automatic.
So, if we try to stick to Ibn al-Haytham's theory, then these tiny babies must have been performing a formal, logical step in their heads, something like this. Premise 1. If an object is unsupported, it will fall. Premise 2. This object is unsupported. Conclusion, therefore, this object will fall. And that's where you see the contradiction, right? The classical view predicts that these infants, who have had very little practice with anything, should be reasoning slowly and with conscious effort. But the evidence shows the complete opposite. They're making these pretty sophisticated inferences automatically and unconsciously way before they can engage in any kind of deliberate thought. Okay, so if that classical one-size-fits-all model doesn't quite work, what's the alternative? Well, to really get the modern view, we need a new toolkit, a new set of concepts. And it's all built around two central ideas: representations and procedures.
First up, let's talk about representation. Now, in cognitive science, when we say representation, we don't mean a little picture in your head. It's a physical thing, like a specific pattern of neurons firing, whose whole job, its function, is to carry information about something out there in the world. It's information made real.
And then we have inferential procedures. So if representations are the information, you can think of procedures as the processes that act on that information.
An inferential procedure takes representations as its input and it transforms them to create new information, or maybe just more reliable information. They're the doers in your mind.
A simple motion detector makes this perfectly clear. When its sensors pick up on movement or heat, they send out electrical signals. Those signals, those are the representations. They carry information. Now these signals get fed into something called an AND gate. That gate, that's the inferential procedure. Its whole function is to process those inputs and produce a new output, like triggering an alarm, but and this is the key, only if it gets both signals at the same time.
So now that we have this distinction between representations and procedures, we can outline two totally different ways the mind can take advantage of the predictable patterns in the world to make inferences. And this right here is the heart of the debate. So on one side, you have the classical method. This method works by first creating an explicit representation of a rule, like a little mental note that says, if you see a snake, then it's dangerous. Then, some kind of general-purpose logic comes along and uses that note to draw a conclusion. But on the other side, you have the modular method. This one doesn't need to write down the rule at all. Instead, it has a specialized, dedicated procedure that's basically hardwired to connect the input, seeing a snake, directly to the output, a feeling of fear. The information isn't written down in a premise, it's literally embodied in the procedure itself.
And this quote just hits the nail on the head. A representation of a rule is just passive information. It's just sitting there. It needs a whole separate process to come along and actually use it. A dedicated procedure, on the other hand, is the process. You give it the right input, and it just automatically does its thing.
Think about a classic example we all know, Pavlov's dog. The modular view would say that the dog doesn't form a mental if-then statement in its head. You know, if the bell rings, then food is coming. Instead, the conditioning process creates a highly specialized little inferential module, a procedure, that just takes the sound of the bell as an input and spits out an expectation of food and salivation as the output. It's a direct, brutally efficient link.
So what happens when we zoom out? What does this mean for how we think about the mind as a whole? Well, it leads us to a modular view of reason, where our mind is kind of like a Swiss Army knife, just packed with all these specialized tools for very specific tasks.
In this view, our cognitive system isn't one big computer. It's made up of tons of these specialized modules all running at the same time, in parallel. Each little nodule is an expert at one thing, fine-tuned over time to exploit a very specific pattern in the world. You might have one for detecting faces, one for understanding grammar, one for inferring how gravity works. And this kind of parallel processing is incredibly powerful. It allows an animal to keep track of countless different opportunities and threats all at once.
So you might be wondering, okay, which method is better? And the answer, which is so cool, is that it totally depends on what you're trying to do. If your goal is to gain abstract general knowledge about snakes, their biology, their habitats, that sort of thing, then representing facts the classical way is probably way more powerful. But if your one and only purpose is to not get bitten, a fast, automatic, reflex-like modular procedure is, without a doubt, your best bet.
And this all leads us to one last really mind-bending idea that kind of flips this whole debate on its head. We tend to think of our slow, conscious, logical reasoning as the master system, right? The CEO that's in charge of everything else. But what if that's all wrong? What if what we call reason isn't a general-purpose processor at all, but is itself just one more highly specialized module in the vast, parallel, and opportunistic toolkit of the human mind?